It's time now for Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good afternoon, all. Craig, we have had a number of predictions about the November election a while back, but none, to my knowledge, anticipated a civil war within the Republican Party after the Trump defeat. The case in point is what is now happening in Georgia, where President Trump and others have attacked the GOP governor and the GOP Secretary of State for certifying a Biden victory there. It has now grown to the point where they and others are concerned about their safety. What on earth is going on with the grand old party? And when does it move away from these Trump unfounded conspiracy theories?
Well, I think it's going to have to take us until January 20th and a moving van and possibly an escort out of the White House. I think Donald Trump is showing increasingly that he's not really of the Republican Party. You've got the Republican Party and you have the Trump partisans, and the Trump partisans are simply not going to surrender in spite of fact after fact, case after case. Now the U.S. Attorney General indicating they can't find fraud. But it's having, and it will continue to have repercussions. I do think it's going to make Trump's standing in the Republican Party after this more problematic. This behavior is not rational, and it's going to, I think, be harder for people to support him if that's what he's seeking. It's really not clear. I think that perhaps part of this game is a fundraising game. You read about the kind of money people have been giving to the Trump organization, which is really a future organization, not so much related to anything going on now. And so maybe by staying in the game the way they're doing it, they're driving revenue into a political organization. But it's damaging to the party as I knew it, although I don't recognize it much anymore. It's damaging, I think, actually to Trump's future, but I'm sure he doesn't see it that way.
Al, what's your take on all this?
First of all, I'm not an expert on Republicans, but I don't really find it particularly surprising that Republicans are fighting in the aftermath of this election. And I suspect that there's going to be a long-term fight over the direction of the Republican Party for some of the reasons that Craig alluded to. You know, intra-party fights are not new in American politics. I've been involved in one for a long time in the Democratic Party. We've been fighting between our centrist and leftist wings for 50 years, and I don't think that's going to abate anytime soon. You know, as usual, Trump brings this to a new level where he sort of subtly encourages his supporters to threaten even Republican state officials who have the audacity to follow the law and do what their duty is. But you know, as Craig said, I think mercifully we're going to be done with this within a month or two. But the long-term fighting in the Republican Party, I think, is going to go on, and I'm going to give you three reasons for it. First, parties that lose presidential elections always fight and over the direction. In this case, Republicans have lost 7 of 8 times with the popular vote, including the last 4 in a row. So basically, any Republican who wants to be president wants to figure out what the problem is and change it. That's why we started the DLC in 1985. Second, and this is really important, Craig sort of alluded to this, but politics in the United States has really changed dramatically, and so have the parties. Think about this. Working class white voters were the core, were the heart of once the heart of the Democratic coalition not very long ago when we started politics. But today, and especially after President Trump, they're the core of the Republican coalition. Suburbanites and educated voters who were were central to a business-oriented, fiscally conservative Republican Party. Today, suburbanites and college-educated voters, in addition to, they're more likely to vote Democratic. And when you add them to urban voters, that's basically the new Democratic coalition. Think of the old Republican Party as symbolized by George H.W. Bush, and the new or the current Republican Party as symbolized by the followers of Donald Trump. Now, when you have that much of a break and a change, you're going to have a fight over the direction, and it's going to, because people are going to want to get control of the party, and that's not going to end. And finally, this is an important thing in both parties. The electorate is so polarized in so many states and so many districts are clearly in one political camp or another. In other words, the Democrats are going to win in some places and the Republicans are certain to win in others, which means primaries are going to be more important than general elections. And what that means is primary fights are inter-party fights. So the Republicans, with the added burden of having to figure out how to get back on the right side of the popular vote for president, will probably have a longer fight, but both parties are going to fight over internally over the future.
But Al, staying with you, at the beginning of the Obama administration, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stated very clearly that his job was to make sure that the new president was a one-term president. Do you think that remains the Republican goal now, or perhaps are you seeing a new era of bipartisanship that President-elect Biden will bring in?
I'm sure Mitch McConnell and the Republicans want to make Joe Biden a one-term president. So I don't think partisanship is going to magically go away. But it is true that a new president will strike a different tone. It'll be less abrasive. It'll be more bipartisan. And hopefully it'll lower the temperature in Washington and on Capitol Hill a little bit. I don't see another era of bipartisanship like we had in the 1980s and 90s, for example, because remember in those days we had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and it was not that hard for them to cross party lines and form bipartisan coalitions. Our parties were coalition parties, which incidentally is important in our system. We sort of now have parliamentary parties in a presidential system, and that doesn't work very well. But I guess I'm a little bit optimistic that the political climate will begin to improve and that Congress will start to work, at least on some things, with a president who was part of Congress and part of the Senate for so long, to do some things in the national interest. So I'm a very little hopeful, but I don't have any illusions that we're going to have a great period of bipartisanship.
Craig, do you have the same feeling?
I've been thinking a lot about this. I have far more people saying to me, what's it going to take to change the way things are working in Washington than people walking up wondering how, as Republicans, we're going to get Biden defeated in 4 years. Probably it says more about the people I talk with these days than the sense of some of the Republicans. But, I think of the phrase that Einstein gave us, which is that continuing to do the same thing over and over again and getting a different result is a definition of insanity. And so as I think about it, I think there's a sentiment among the electorate that says we want these public officials that we send to Washington and to state houses to deal with problems that are affecting us. And I'd like to think that there's some path forward that, first of all, is based on getting the leadership on both parties working together. And frankly, they need a lot more experience and practice at it because they haven't been doing it. And so they need to find issues around which there can be consensus with less difficulty. And I think infrastructure is one of those issues. You hear leading Democrats talk about it, leading Republicans, the governors, the mayors. It's something that, especially with the amount of money we're spending and trying to push into the economy, that would produce jobs, it would address real systemic problems in the country with respect to the infrastructure. And I'd like to see them tackle that. If suddenly we have to go solve the healthcare problem, It's just too hard. They just have been at each other so long that they need more experience, and they need to approach it differently. Ultimately, I think Al would agree, our many friends on both sides of the aisle, ultimately what they fear the most is defeat at the polls. And I think, therefore, this is really in the hands of the voters. If we're just going to continue to tolerate the bickering and the back and forth that's going on, then we're going to get more of it. If we're going to hold them to a higher standard, then we're going to convince people that they've actually got to produce and do some of the things they were elected to do. So I'm a little more optimistic because I think the voter is going to actually push this harder than perhaps they have in the past. But I will say that it's a real uphill fight to get these people working more closely together.
We'll have to leave it there. Craig Fuller, Al Fromm, thanks so much.